The K9 bolted. No one saw it coming. 1 second, the soldier stood quietly at the courtroom doors, head bowed, fists clenched. The next, his old partner, Rex, snapped the leash free and charged into the heart of the courtroom like a missile. Gasps exploded from every corner. The judge froze mid-sentence. A young bailiff stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair, but the dog wasn't attacking, he was running towards someone. Captain Miles Carter barely had time to react. The leash burned in his hand as it slipped through. "Rex!" he barked, instinctively. Too late. All eyes followed the German Shepherd as he raced, not toward the defendant, not the prosecution, but to a woman seated in the gallery. She didn't move, couldn't. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, eyes wide, trembling lips parting as the 80-pound dog skidded to a stop before her. And then he sat, perfectly still, staring at her. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the judge leaned forward, glasses slipping halfway down his nose. The woman stared back at the dog like she'd seen a ghost, and in a way, she had, because Rex wasn't just any military K9. He'd been reported dead 2 years ago, during an ambush in Kandahar, and the woman he now sat before was the widow of the soldier whose death that ambush had covered up. A soft whimper left Rex's throat. Not a growl, not a bark, just recognition. Grief. Something deep. Something human. Miles stood frozen just inside the courtroom doors. His throat clenched shut. That sound, it took him back, 2 years back. The ambush, the explosion, the lies. He'd buried the truth for too long. Buried it with a carefully staged report, a doctored autopsy, and a flag-draped casket sent home with hollow honors. And now his dog was digging it all up in the middle of a courtroom. Because this wasn't just a goodbye. This was a reckoning. Rex looked over his shoulder at Miles, that same intense stare he used in the field when he caught a scent no one else could smell, when he knew something everyone else missed, and then he turned back to the widow, Sarah Blake. She hadn't spoken a word. Her eyes shimmered. Her hand hovered mid-air like she wanted to touch him but didn't dare. Because if this dog was real, if this wasn't some cruel look-alike, then the story she'd been told about her husband's death had a hole in it wide. Enough to fall through. Miles took a step forward, just one, enough to trigger a reaction from the bailiffs, who reached for their holsters instinctively. But he wasn't a threat. Not to them, only to himself. Because the courtroom wasn't even about him. He wasn't a defendant, wasn't on trial. Not officially. He was only here to say goodbye. Today was Rex's final public service ceremony before retirement. They were going to give him a medal, shake hands, take photos. Then Rex would be transferred to a civilian shelter where adoption papers waited, already signed. But this moment had changed everything, because Rex had chosen her, not the medal, not the script, not the quiet, honorable ending everyone expected. He had walked straight into a lie and sat in front of the one person who deserved to know the truth. The silence stretched, thick as smoke, until Sarah finally whispered, "Why is he looking at me like that?" No one answered, not even the judge. But Miles knew Rex remembered the scent, the one clinging to Sarah's skin, her clothes, her soul, the scent of Private Daniel Blake, her husband, Miles's best friend, the man he couldn't save, or so he'd told himself. But the truth was worse than death, and now it was crawling out of the shadows. Miles clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering in his ears. Rex didn't forget. Never had. He remembered the way Daniel had screamed. The blood. The orders Miles disobeyed. The final decision to leave him behind and report the body as unrecoverable. But the body had been recovered, just not by the military. Someone else had gotten there first. And now, 2 years later, the court was about to uncover everything. Not because of new evidence, not because of a brave whistleblower, but because an aging German shepherd had walked into a courtroom and chosen a side, and it wasn't his handlers. As the judge finally found his voice and called for order, Miles took another step forward. Rex turned sharply and growled, Not at a stranger, but at him. The handler he'd trusted his whole life, the man who'd trained him to obey without question. But this time, Rex was refusing the command. And that meant only one thing. He remembered what Miles had done. He used to believe that orders meant something, that if you followed them, you were a good soldier, a good man. That belief shattered the day he left Daniel Blake behind. Captain Miles Carter had been in command of Alpha Team 9, 6 elite operatives, including himself, and 1 K9 unit. Rex had been more than a dog. He was the heartbeat of the team, a silent shadow who sniffed out ambushes before they detonated, a protector, a brother, just like Daniel. Daniel Blake wasn't the loudest or strongest, but he had a laugh that could cut through even the bloodiest days. He'd bring out Rex's soft side, sneaking scraps of jerky, scratching behind his ears when no one was looking. Sometimes Miles would catch the two of them sitting alone during night watch, just man and dog, staring into the desert like they were trying to read its secrets. But the desert bit back harder than any of them expected. The ambush was sudden. 3 men down within seconds, smoke, screaming, and then Daniel went missing. Protocol was clear. Fall back, regroup, don't risk more lives searching for the unrecoverable. But Rex wouldn't accept that. He fought the leash, dragged Miles toward the burning convoy, toward the screaming, and Miles, God. Help him, let go. He still doesn't know what made him do it. Guilt, hope, desperation. All he knows is Rex ran into the smoke and didn't come out. They found him 2 days later, barely alive, burned, limping, covered in someone else's blood. And the body they recovered next to him, half buried beneath rubble and shrapnel, didn't have a face. It was enough for a closed casket funeral, enough to declare Daniel Blake dead, enough to sign the papers and bury the guilt. Miles tried to move on. He took a desk job, spoke at military funerals, cleaned up Rex's discharge file and made sure the dog would have a quiet retirement. But there were cracks. Rex would growl at certain uniforms, refuse to enter certain rooms. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd whimper and bark, snarling at shadows no one else could see. Miles pretended not to notice, pretended Rex was just aging, but deep down he knew the dog remembered, and so did he. That's why today was supposed to be closure, a ceremony, a final salute, a medal pinned to the animal that had saved lives, including his. He'd planned to walk away quietly after that, never tell Sarah the truth, never tell her that he had heard Daniel's voice on the radio after the explosion, that the scream for help came after the call to fall back, that he could have disobeyed orders, could have tried but didn't, and now the dog had dragged it all back into the light. As Miles stood in the courtroom watching Rex glare at him with unblinking eyes, he felt it, not just guilt, fear. Because if Rex remembered everything, then someone else might too, and they might already be here watching, waiting for the truth to explode all over again. The court was eerily quiet as the doors swung open, and Captain Miles Carter took his first step inside. His boots echoed in the cavernous room, reverberating off the polished marble floors. The heavy scent of paper and law books filled the air, mixing with the faint stench of fear. He'd been here many times before, but today, this was different. This wasn't just another military trial. This was a final act of closure. He had come to end things. Rex stood beside him, tail still, eyes locked forward. The courtroom buzzed as people shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. They knew the ex-soldier and his K9 had a bond, but what no one knew was how much that bond would tear open today. Miles had assumed this would be a simple ceremony, a respectful acknowledgement of Rex's service. The dog was older now, graying fur at the temples, a limp in his step, but he was still fierce in his gaze. Still sharp as ever. "Captain Carter, you may approach the stand." The judge's voice cracked through the quiet. Miles's throat tightened as he led Rex up to the center of the room. He could feel eyes following them, some curious, some sympathetic. Everyone expected an easy, emotional goodbye, but deep inside, Miles knew better. Nothing about today was easy. He glanced down at Rex, his hand hovering over the dog's weathered head. Rex turned his eyes up at him, something almost human in their depths. The dog's nostrils flared slightly as if sensing something in the air, and that's when Miles saw it. In the far corner of the courtroom, a shadow flickered. Someone was watching them, someone he didn't recognize. A tall figure, cloaked in black, sitting silently at the back, almost blending into the shadows. The figure's eyes were fixed not on the dog but on him. "Captain Carter," the judge called again, his voice stern but concerned. "Are you all right?" Miles blinked, trying to shake the strange sensation gnawing at the back of his mind. He nodded stiffly, focusing back on the task at hand. This was for Rex, for the memories, for the last piece of the past he could still hold on to, and then it happened. Without warning, Rex began to growl. A deep, primal sound that echoed through the room like thunder. The audience froze. Their eyes widened in disbelief. Rex, the perfect military dog, had never done this. He'd always been well-trained, always calm in situations like this. But today, he was on edge, his body tense, his fur bristling. The low growl continued, sending a ripple of unease through the courtroom. "Rex," Miles whispered, his voice low, hoping the dog would calm down. But Rex didn't stop. He took a step forward, and then another. The growling turned into a snarl, his teeth bared. The room erupted into chaos. "Control your dog!" someone shouted from the crowd. The judge slammed his gavel, but it was useless. The courtroom was descending into panic, and Miles, gripped by fear, couldn't understand what was happening. Why was Rex reacting like this? What was he sensing that no one else could? And then Rex did the unthinkable. He lunged, not at the judge, not at the soldiers or the audience. He lunged at the man in the shadows. For a split second, everything went silent. It was like the air itself froze. The shadowed figure didn't even flinch as Rex leaped toward him, snarling with all the fury of a wounded animal. And just before impact, the figure stepped aside with unnerving calm, not even attempting to defend himself. But that wasn't what stunned everyone. As Rex landed on the ground, his body skidding across the polished marble, he didn't rise immediately. He was stunned, frozen. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring at something Miles couldn't see. The shadowy figure smiled. Miles's heart pounded in his chest. His knees almost buckled. This couldn't be real. He wasn't supposed to feel this again. And yet, the man's eyes never left Miles. Not a word was spoken, but the message was clear. Rex had recognized him. Miles stood frozen in shock, his mind racing. There was something about this man, something terrifyingly familiar. He was not just a random observer. He wasn't here by accident. And then, as if in slow motion, the man leaned forward just enough for his lips to barely part. "He remembers," the stranger said, his voice low but chilling. Rex let out a sharp yelp, shaking his head, as if to clear the fog that had suddenly descended over him. His eyes flickered back to Miles, and for a moment it seemed like the dog didn't even know who he was anymore. The courtroom was silent. Miles didn't know what to do, where to look. The room seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with its weight. The man in the back wasn't just a stranger. He was part of something that had been buried, forgotten, something Miles had buried. Rex wasn't just growling at him. Rex was warning him. The dog knew. He knew the truth. The ex-soldier had thought that this moment would give him peace, a way to say goodbye to his canine companion, to close the door on the past, but instead it was opening wide, and there was no telling what would come out. This is where the tension really starts to build. The courtroom scene is now thrown into chaos, and there's a heavy sense of foreboding surrounding the mysterious man in the shadows. The truth is lurking, and Rex knows something that Miles isn't ready to face. The chaos in the courtroom subsided, but only after what felt like an eternity. Rex, after a long moment of hesitation, finally stood up on trembling legs, his tail tucked between his legs. He looked up at Miles, confusion still etched in his eyes. The tension was thick in the air, and the weight of the moment seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Miles felt like he was suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the figure in the back, who had now disappeared into the shadows. "Captain Carter," the judge bellowed, attempting to regain control of the room. "Get your dog under control. This is unacceptable behavior." Miles nodded quickly. Though his mind wasn't on the judge's reprimand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that Rex had been trying to warn him about something, or someone. But the audience was unsettled, murmurs spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. "I'm sorry," Miles said hoarsely, guiding Rex back to his side. "He's just not himself today." The judge seemed to buy the explanation, but his glare was sharp. "You'd better make sure he's under control for the rest of the proceedings, Captain." The courtroom quieted as the judge resumed the trial, though the tension in the air was palpable. Rex, still unsettled, stayed close to Miles, his body still tight, his eyes darting back toward the back of the room. It was almost as if the dog was waiting for something else to happen, something more. But the room grew more relaxed as time passed. The shock of the incident seemed to fade. Miles took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and looked at Rex. The dog's eyes were filled with concern, but also a flicker of recognition, as if something had snapped into place. Perhaps, just perhaps, the moment was over. Maybe the truth he feared was buried deep enough for today. Miles had come to say goodbye. Maybe now he could do that. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, yet a sense of false calm seemed to blanket the room. Miles even allowed himself to feel a slight sense of relief. Rex was no longer growling. The shadowy figure hadn't shown himself again, but the world had a way of deceiving you, didn't it? "Captain Carter, please come forward," the judge called once again, pulling Miles from his thoughts. Miles glanced down at Rex, still by his side, and slowly stood. This was the moment, the last goodbye. He had done his part, faced the fears, and now maybe, just maybe, he could walk away from this chapter. Rex would be with a new family, someone who could give him the care he deserved, even if it wasn't with Miles, even if it was better this way. "I hereby declare that this K9, Rex, has served his country with honor," the judge announced in a voice that reverberated through the stillness of the room. "And with that, we recognize his retirement from active duty." A single tear slid down Miles's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but there was no hiding the emotion. He was letting go of his partner, his friend, the dog who had fought beside him in countless battles, both foreign and domestic. Rex had been there when everything else had fallen apart, and now he was supposed to walk away. The judge's voice droned on, but Miles wasn't listening anymore. All he could focus on was Rex, his loyal companion, standing beside him. But then, just as he thought it was over, just as he allowed himself to believe the worst was behind them, the courtroom door suddenly swung open. The shadowy figure from earlier stepped into the room again. This time he was no longer a mere observer. This time he was standing in front of them. The same piercing eyes locked onto Miles, and there was no mistaking it now. This man wasn't just some random spectator. The figure stepped forward, his lips curling into a cold smile, his presence casting a dark pall over everything. Rex's growl returned immediately, low and ferocious, as if he had sensed the man's true intent all along. But Miles stood still, paralyzed. The courtroom had gone silent once again. Everyone turned to watch, their gazes shifting between the two men, the dog and the stranger. The figure's voice was calm, almost too calm, as he addressed the judge. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake." Miles felt the blood drain from his face. His heart stopped beating in his chest. It couldn't be. No, it couldn't be. The figure's eyes locked onto Miles again, and he spoke words that Miles never expected to hear. "I'm here to collect what's mine." Miles froze, the air thickening around him as he heard the words from the figure. "I'm here to collect what's mine." His stomach churned as if the earth beneath. His feet had just been pulled away, leaving him to plummet into a void. Rex's growl deepened, but this time it wasn't aimed at the man standing before them. It was a warning Miles failed to heed. The courtroom felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating him. All the years of service, the missions, the blood shed alongside his faithful K9, was it all for nothing? He had spent so much time convinced that leaving Rex in the hands of another family was the best thing for him. A family who could provide for Rex in ways Miles could no longer. A life that wasn't tainted by war and scars, both physical and emotional. But the figure in front of him, the man with those cold, calculating eyes, was ruining everything. "Who are you?" Miles managed to choke out, his voice thick with disbelief, his hands trembling. The figure's smile only deepened. "You don't remember me? Perhaps you've forgotten, but I haven't. I'm the reason you're standing here, trying to give up everything that's left of you." He took a step forward, his presence like an unshakable weight pressing down on Miles's chest. Rex, sensing the change, shifted beside Miles. His body was tense, his fur bristling. This wasn't just any stranger. This was someone who knew Miles, knew him in ways that even Miles himself had long tried to forget. The crowd in the courtroom had grown silent, the tension rising with each passing second. But Miles couldn't hear them. His world had narrowed to this single, crushing moment. The figure, the man who had been lurking in the shadows, now revealed himself to be more than a mere bystander. He was a ghost from Miles' past, a ghost he thought was dead and buried. "You," Miles began, his throat tightening as the truth began to click into place, though he wished it hadn't. The memories came flooding back like a floodgate that had been unlocked. Faces, names, events he had tried so desperately to suppress. This man wasn't just an ordinary person. He was a former military contractor, someone who had turned on Miles in the darkest of times. A man whose betrayal had cost them everything. The weight of that betrayal, the feeling of being torn apart by the one person he thought he could trust, washed over him again. It felt like a knife, twisting deep into his gut. "Why are you here?" Miles whispered, barely able to speak through the lump in his throat. The anger, the pain, and the fear were too much to contain. The figure, the man who had betrayed him and many others, smiled with that same malicious grin. "I'm here to collect what's mine, Carter. The one thing you can never truly own." Miles looked down at Rex, his loyal companion, his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. This was supposed to be a goodbye. This was supposed to be the end of a chapter, peaceful, final. But now all of it was unraveling. Rex's ears were pinned back, his body still rigid. He too was affected by the presence of the man, but Miles couldn't make sense of any of it. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made for this dog, for their bond, had just been torn apart. The courtroom fell deeper into silence. Miles stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The betrayal, the anger, the shame, all of it, crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. He thought he had done the right thing. He thought he was setting Rex free, giving him a life he couldn't provide. But now, standing in front of this man, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. What had he been fighting for? Was it all in vain? But then, in the quiet of the courtroom, Rex's voice broke through the noise in Miles's mind. Not in words, but in a silent, unwavering bond that had never wavered, even when the world had fallen apart around them. Miles turned to look at Rex, seeing the unwavering loyalty in the dog's eyes. This wasn't just about Rex's future anymore. This was about Miles's redemption, about the part of him that had died when he left the battlefield, and everything he had known. Rex hadn't given up on him, and now Miles realized he couldn't give up either. The darkness that had settled over him began to lift, if only for a moment. The fire that had once burned inside him, the fire that had driven him to survive the horrors of war, was still there. It wasn't extinguished, it wasn't over. The man may have thought he had won, but Miles wasn't ready to give up, not now, not when Rex was by his side. Not this time, Miles whispered to himself. He wasn't alone anymore. The silence in the courtroom felt suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of the truth that had been waiting to come to light. Miles stood there, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white with the force of his struggle. Rex remained beside him, unwavering, a steady anchor in the storm that threatened to consume him. The figure, this man who had been hiding in plain sight, was no longer just a distant threat. He was the heart of the darkness Miles had been trying to outrun, the ghost from his past that he had hoped would never resurface. But here he was, standing before them all, smirking like a predator who knew exactly how to bring his prey to the edge of despair. "Carter," the man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You really thought you could escape me, didn't you?" The words hit Miles like a ton of bricks. The betrayal he had buried so deep, the nights he had spent torturing himself with the memories, the anger he had tried to channel into something productive. It all came rushing back in a flood. The truth of it was undeniable. This man wasn't just someone from his past. This was the architect of his greatest downfall. The one who had orchestrated the chaos that tore apart everything he had fought for, his career, his comrades, and most painfully, his trust in everyone around him. But as the truth settled into his bones, a strange clarity began to form. Everything that had led up to this moment, everything he had believed, every step he had taken, every painful decision he had made, was now part of a bigger puzzle. A puzzle he was just beginning to piece together. You were behind it all, Miles whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. The man's smile didn't falter. He knew Miles had connected the dots. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down, and now that it had, he reveled in the power it gave him. Of course I was, the man said, his tone dripping with a sickening calmness. I knew you'd never believe it until you saw it for yourself. You were too busy trying to protect that damn dog to see the bigger picture. The words stung more than Miles could have imagined. Rex, his loyal companion, was the very thing that had kept him going, the thing that had driven him to survive the unthinkable. And yet here was this man, claiming that his bond with Rex was nothing but a distraction, a weakness, a mistake. But as the world around him seemed to crumble, as the anger surged like fire through his veins, something unexpected happened. Miles wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't afraid. He was clear. The betrayal hurt, yes. It cut deeper than anything he had ever known. But it wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming control over the narrative of his life. It was about standing up for himself, for Rex, for the choices he had made. And it was about one thing that had always been constant in his life, his bond with Rex. That bond was his strength, not his weakness. Why did you do it? Miles asked, his voice steady now. Why betray me? Why use me like this? The man's smirk faded slightly, but his eyes still gleamed with malice. Because I could, because you were so blinded by your loyalty to that dog. You never saw how far I was willing to go to get what I wanted. And then, just as Miles thought he was starting to understand the twisted logic behind the man's actions, a truth far darker emerged. The man wasn't just some rogue contractor with a personal vendetta. No, this was something far more sinister. He was part of a larger web, a network that had been manipulating Miles and everyone he had ever trusted since the very beginning. You're not just some lone wolf, are you? Miles said slowly, his mind reeling as the pieces continued to fall into place. You're part of something bigger, something you never told me. The man's eyes flickered. For just a fraction of a second, the facade cracked, and in that split second, Miles saw the truth. This man wasn't acting alone. He was a cog in a much larger machine, one that had been pulling strings in the shadows for years, one that had orchestrated the horrors of Miles's past. Miles's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full scope of the conspiracy. Everything he had believed in, the things he thought he had done to protect Rex, to protect those he cared about, had all been manipulated. The false missions, the covert operations, the betrayals, every single step had been carefully designed to break him, to isolate him, to make him question everything he had ever known. The pieces clicked into place, and Miles knew what had to be done. Rex, he whispered, his gaze shifting down to his canine. We're not done yet. Rex's tail wagged slightly, a quiet, reassuring movement that grounded Miles in the present. The weight of the revelation was still heavy, but Rex was with him. They had been through worse together. They had survived the unthinkable, and they would survive this too. The man before them wasn't invincible. He wasn't the mastermind. He was just a part of a larger game. And it was a game that Miles, now that he knew the rules, was ready to finish. I'm not going to let you win, Miles said, his voice now full of conviction. Not this time. The man's smile faltered for the first time, just a hint of uncertainty creeping into his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Miles to find his strength so quickly. But it was too late. The truth was out. The battle lines had been drawn. And now Miles was ready to fight for everything he had left. In this climactic moment, Miles uncovers the full extent of the betrayal and manipulation that had been working against him. The shocking truth is revealed, but instead of breaking him, it empowers him. He and Rex are now united with a renewed sense of purpose, and they will face whatever comes next together. Just as the room seemed to calm, the air thick with tension and the bitter taste of betrayal, there was a sudden shift. It was barely perceptible at first, just a slight flicker in the man's eyes. But Miles caught it. His instincts kicked in immediately, that same sharp awareness that had saved him countless times in the field. He turned to look at Rex, who was still standing beside him, calm yet alert. The dog's muscles were tense, his eyes locked on something just out of view, something that Miles couldn't yet see. And then, the noise. It was the smallest of sounds, a footstep too light to be detected by the others in the room, but to Miles it was as loud as thunder. He turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was someone he never expected to see. Lena, Miles breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Lena, his former partner. The one person he had trusted above all others. The one person he thought had died in that tragic ambush years ago. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. Alive. And then the words she spoke sent the room into chaos. I didn't die, Miles. I faked my death. And I'm the one who put this whole thing into motion. The courtroom was in complete silence. No one dared to breathe, no one dared to move. Miles couldn't tear his eyes away from Lena as she stood in the doorway, the weight of years of secrecy, betrayal and broken trust hanging heavy in the air between them. Rex, his loyal companion, growled lowly, his hackles raised, sensing the tension that swirled through the room like an invisible storm. It was as if Rex knew this wasn't just an ordinary betrayal. This was something far deeper, something that tied into the very heart of everything Miles had ever fought for. Lena stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing in the silent room. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. They were filled with guilt, regret, but also a fire that for a moment reminded Miles of the person he once knew, the partner he had trusted with his life. Why, Lena? Miles finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. Lena's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment it seemed like she was going to break down, that the weight of everything she had carried all these years would overwhelm her. But then she took a deep breath, steadying herself. I never meant for it to go this far, Miles, she said quietly, her words cutting through the stillness. I had no choice. The people I was working for, they promised me I could save. You saved both of us. She paused, swallowing hard. But in the end, all I did was ruin everything. Miles didn't know whether to believe her. He wanted to. He wanted to believe that Lena was still the person he had fought beside, that the woman in front of him wasn't a stranger, but he couldn't ignore the years of lies, the betrayal that had been woven into the very fabric of their relationship. What happened? Miles demanded, his voice rising slightly, desperate for the truth. Who are you working for? What is all of this? Lena's gaze dropped to the floor, as if ashamed to meet his eyes. I didn't have a choice, she repeated, her voice trembling. The people behind this, they're powerful. They control everything, every move we make, every action we take. I had to fake my death. I had to do it to protect you. But why? Miles asked, frustration and confusion battling within him. Why bring Rex into this? Why the court? Why make me believe you were dead? Lena's face twisted with pain, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to Rex, the canine who had stood by Miles through everything, the dog who had been his constant companion in the darkest of times. Rex, sensing the shift in the air, let out a low whine and took a step forward, his sharp eyes never leaving Lena's face. Lena reached out, her fingers trembling, but before she could touch Rex, the dog let out a growl, low and warning. Rex wasn't having it. Miles, please, Lena begged, her voice cracking. I never wanted this for him. I never wanted to bring him into this mess. She paused, her expression shifting as a new resolve seemed to form. But I didn't have a choice. Miles glanced at Rex, the dog's eyes still locked on Lena. The bond between the two was undeniable. Rex had always been there, always protecting. Miles, even when the odds were stacked against them. It was then that Miles realized something. Lena wasn't just guilty of betraying him. She had betrayed everything they had fought for. She had allowed Rex, the most loyal creature he had ever known, to become a pawn in this twisted game. And for that, Miles couldn't forgive her. "You've lied to me, Lena," he said, his voice steady now, filled with a cold resolve. "You've lied to everyone in this room, and I can't keep pretending it's all for a greater good." Lena's face crumpled in guilt, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She knew deep down that Miles was right. She had made choices that had led to the destruction of everything they had once built, and in that moment she knew there was no going back. "Please," she whispered, "let me explain." But Miles had already made up his mind. There was no explaining the hurt, the betrayal, the way she had manipulated everything. The truth had come out, but it didn't change the fact that the damage was done. As the courtroom filled with whispers and gasps, Miles turned to leave, his hand on Rex's collar. The dog's head tilted, sensing the shift in the air, but he followed without hesitation, his loyalty to Miles unwavering. Rex knew that no matter what happened, he would stand by Miles until the very end. Just before they reached the door, Lena called out to them one last time, her voice breaking. "Miles, please don't leave me like this. I didn't want to destroy you." But Miles didn't turn back. He couldn't. The bond between him and Rex was unbreakable, stronger than any betrayal, stronger than any past friendship. He had to move on for himself, for Rex, and for the future. As he and Rex stepped out into the cold air, Miles felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth had been exposed, and though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. Miles wasn't going to let anyone control his fate anymore, not even Lena. This heart-wrenching journey of a soldier and his K9 will stay with you long after the story ends. But we want to know what you think. Do you think the K9 was trying to protect its handler or reveal a deeper truth? What would you have done if you were in the soldier's shoes, facing both a loss and an unexpected betrayal? How do you think the bond between the soldier and his K9 truly shaped the outcome of the court case? Do you believe some bonds between humans and animals are stronger than any legal battle? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We can't wait to hear what you think.